Hello everyone and welcome to this video on performance assessment. We have spoken before on the unit about how important performance assessment and performance monitoring are to having a positive working relationship between suppliers and procurers, and how important it is to monitor performance in order to really try and align the structural interests of both procurer and supplier. However, the actual mechanics of performance assessment are very contextual. They depend on the kind of contract, and because we're talking about performance assessment here, particularly in the context of SLAs, so the kind of service that's actually being delivered, the length of the contract, the actual mechanics are going to be dependent upon that. But we still can take a look at a couple of key issues, namely the type of performance assessment being used, as well as the relationship between SLAs, KPIs, and success factors. And that's what we're going to focus on in this video. So if we start with the basic question of why performance assessment is so important, well, it's a list of things that you would expect. So issues and problems that can be identified before they become major problems. So with adequate performance assessment and performance monitoring, you're able to identify things that are starting to slip, and this is where motivation and supplier motivation really comes in. It's unlikely that you'd go from adequate performance to very quickly unacceptable performance levels. It's likely to be a gradual process or a slope. If you're able to identify this early on, then you can take steps to rectify it quickly. But if you do not identify this, so deliveries start coming in slightly later and later, quality standards start slipping, response time start lengthening. If you don't get this picked up, you're effectively signaling to the supplier that these issues are not of major importance, and you're not taking performance all that seriously. If we remember from our supplier management week, that basic formula of supplier motivation is supplier performance is ability plus multiplied by motivation. And what we're doing here is we're reducing the motivation because there are no significant consequences. So regardless of any monetary compensation, it's still going to be going without consequence in the form of actually being pulled up, being notified, having operation to operation level contact, or even being escalated to management level. All of these things are consequences for poor performance, and all of these things will increase motivation. So this has to be done within the context of performance monitoring and assessment, and that will then encourage suppliers to perform better. So we forget the basic kind of human need to be seen to be doing well as doing well. If you're not being seen at all, so if metrics aren't being tracked, if suppliers that have a dip in performance have no feedback whatsoever, that's going to be a clear sign that there is no upside to dedicating more resources and more effort to actually executing the contract. They're still going to get paid the same. When it comes to multi-supplier contracts, if you go back to our lecture on supplier forms, and we talked about different contractual forms that have multiple suppliers, well, this would allow you to quickly identify poor performing suppliers and then make amendments or adjustments to your distribution within a broader multi-supplier framework. And ultimately it will result in cost savings, not just long-term cost savings in terms of having properly motivated suppliers and a strong feedback mechanism, also potentially short-term cost savings if you pair a proper performance assessment regime with a well-written adequate service level agreement as well. So with that said, if we look at the two major performance assessment types that we have fulfillment performance and development performance. These are two different types of assessment. So they're frameworks, conceptual frameworks that we can actually take data that we've gathered. So this is presuming that you have adequate metrics in place, so data is either being collected manually or you have automated systems in place to generate reports that have the performance data that you've already identified as being key. So KPIs typically, or any other kind of performance data. These are conceptual frameworks in which we're going to use. So it's an either or scenario. You're either using fulfillment performance as an assessment type, or using development performance as an assessment type to process and feed back to the supplier. It is very much an either or scenario, and they are connected to very much the specification that would have been set out early on in the procurement cycle. So fulfillment performance assessment is closely associated with conformance specifications, whereas development performance assessment is associated with performance specifications rather than conformance specifications. So if we look at these turn by turn, with the first fulfillment performance assessment, because it's associated with a conformance specification, that means the requirements are very well known. It can be a fairly routine procurement or ongoing regular procurement activity. So therefore, what we really want to assess here is on hard metrics, and we want to assess on a fairly standardized format. So looking at quality, quantity, time, and prices. So everything which has been set in the contract itself or in the service level agreement, and you're judging upon the actual fulfillment. And obviously you would take extraordinary circumstances into account, but that's not the primary assessment which is being carried out. You're not assessing the internal performance of the supplier. You're not looking at their internal resources. You're not looking at their development of experience. You are primarily just looking at their fulfillment and nothing else. And that would go very well with a type of procurement cycle where the requirements and the practicalities of the procurement activity are very well known. If instead of using a conformance specification, we're looking at a performance specification, so there's some ambiguity to the requirements, you're getting significant input from the supplier, or you're getting a significant amount of uncertainty, whether it's to do with the availability of elements of the service, whether it's to do with the suitability of the solution, or there's something novel about the procurement activity that you're having to lean on the supplier's expertise and knowledge. So it would be a more suitable type of assessment to use development performance assessment. So here, you're not just looking at the fulfillment, you are actually primarily looking at the internal processes of the supplier. So you will still be assessing them, but you'll be assessing them on the interactions, you'll be assessing them on the degree of transparency that they show when it comes to collaborating and allowing an insight into their own processes, as well as their rate of improvements and the proactivity of their improvements. So you're judging them on a holistic scale, because for some reason or another, either related to the uncertainty around or ambiguity around the requirements, or some degree of novelty in the procurement cycle, is not sufficient to just judge the fulfillment. It's necessary to actually examine how the performance of the supplier from an internal point of view is going. So the resources that they're dedicating to improvements, whether there's an adequate feedback cycle in place, whether there's evidence that the feedback being provided is having a material impact on the actual activities that the supplier is engaging in. All of these things would be of primary importance, rather than just the metrics of fulfillment. So if we move on to performance appraisal methods, and what I'm particularly interested in here is looking at three major concepts and how they actually interact. So we have SLAs, CSFs, lots and lots of acronyms here, critical success factors, and lastly KPIs or key performance indicators. We have a distinct video on SLAs, so I'm not going to go over and bore you guys even more with a repeat of our discussion on SLAs. Instead, I am going to look specifically at KPIs and critical success factors. These are often confused or melded together quite often, so it's worth just taking a moment and distinguishing them. So KPIs are quantitative metrics. They tend to, or they attempt to measure the performance of the process which is being monitored. So they do rely on quantitative hard measurements, whether in our example of an office style paper delivery company, it's on the number of defects per delivery, the conformance to the delivery schedule, the response times to queries. All of these things would be considered or can be considered as KPIs. They have adequate solidity. There's a degree of agreement as to the reality of the things being measured. There's not interpretive, but rather they lend themselves to being descriptive statistics, and they are quantitative. They can be easily quantified. The exact KPIs chosen, as we're going to discuss in a moment, can really have huge ramifications, but the fact that they are quantitative metrics does unify them. Critical success factors, on the other hand, are not metrics. They're not designed to be quantified and measured in the same way as KPIs, but rather they're the identification of what the underlying necessities for a successful, in this case, procurement relationship actually is. So critical success factors for a paper delivery contract aren't just going to involve the mechanics of the deliveries. They can involve the relationship management elements. They can involve things that involve the actual receiving of goods. They can involve the forecasting of needs. All of these things are critical success factors. What we need to be trying to do is identifying holistic critical success factors that already identify what the underlying foundations for a successful process are. They can get confused with KPIs, and you do have an easy knee-jerk response of, well, let's identify and monitor the critical success factors, and then they slip into the same world as KPIs. But critical success factors, despite the name, are not monitoring or measuring the success of a process. They're identifications of what the requirements for success are. So what we need to avoid doing is being recursive in how we set critical success factors. Being recursive would be a case of saying, well, a critical success factor for a successful paper delivery would be that the paper is delivered on time. That's not a foundation for a successful paper delivery process. That's the reality or the output of a successful paper delivery process. So we can't be recursive and just look at the reality, the output of a success. We need to be looking deeper and looking at what the underlying structural requirements for success are. I've said all of this without the correct slide on the screen, but I will get the correct slide up now. So three basic questions that we can ask ourselves here. So what's necessary for us to get to the desired outcome? So we are avoiding describing the desired outcome, but we're looking at the underlying factors which are needed to achieve it. So looking at the holistic approach of the performance of the entire organization, what areas of performance are critical, and what we want to try and do with critical success factors is look beyond the performance of just the operational staff that are immediately involved in the delivery or the execution of the process, but rather look at things like governance and like management. Sources of information, support staff areas that can allow for the desired outcome, allow for a successful process. So any critical success factors which make no mention whatsoever of governance structures, which make no mention whatsoever of the role of management, are unlikely to be really relevant or meaningful critical success factors. They're placing the entire burden of success upon the directly involved operational staff, and that's not a solid foundation to actually understand and appraise and assess that process itself. So we want to avoid that altogether, and we want to have a holistic approach. And then lastly, from an organizational point of view, identifying the required competencies, and therefore that should be leading on to a natural conversation of, do we have these competencies internally? If we have identified these competencies as critical success factors, we need to then invest in making sure that there is adequate resource to either develop or to maintain these competencies. So taking an organizational perspective rather than just an operational perspective. So if we move on to KPIs, and this is something that you guys will no doubt be familiar with within projects you've worked on, or within operational KPIs within your own organizations. And this sometimes is misunderstood as well. So I think the common understanding is that KPIs are the measurement of how successful something is the measurement of performance. That's something which I'm really quite uncomfortable with. I think the key term in the acronym is indicators. They give you an indication of performance, and you're, for whatever reason, identified these as key. But it is not a direct measure of performance. We have to go back and connect it to our qualitative objectives versus our quantitative tools. I always think that marking is a really good example of all three of these questions. Marking is a quantitative measure, so the grades on a particular course, whether it's an apprenticeship or a university course or any kind of course, is some kind of measurement of the performance of the students or the apprentices on that course. The first question, can it be reliably measured? The answer, generally speaking, is yes. If you have the appropriate assessments in place, then you can just collect the grades. It can be reliably measured with any kind of necessary amendments or mitigations put into place. But the second question is quite challenging. Does it actually measure what you want it to actually measure? So we have to recognize that there will always be a tension between qualitative objectives and quantitative measurements, and this is where the practical reality of performance appraisal really starts to kind of develop some clear tensions. So sticking to our example, the qualitative objective of a course or a unit or any kind of organized period of structured study is learning. So what we want to do is to foster learning and to achieve particular learning objectives. If you were to go through your course handbook or the course information form, or indeed you were to go through the unit information forms, you'll see that all of the learning objectives are qualitatively stated. That's because it's impossible to have a quantitatively framed learning objective. It just doesn't make sense. That's not how people learn. In the very similar way. Almost all of the corporate vision statements will be qualitatively stated. All of the long-term strategic plans may have various quantitative KPIs put in, but if you strip away the KPIs, you'll be left with qualitative strategic objectives. This is simply the reality of the social world and business, despite all of the attempts to portray it as a field of study which is about nuts and bolts and mathematical equations and various other things, is fundamentally taking place within the qualitative world of human interactions, and it is a social phenomenon. So we have these qualitative objectives, and then we are attempting to apply quantitative metrics upon it. So if we take our learning objectives and we say, well, grades are a measure of how well the learning objectives have been met. In fact, that's what the exam boards are fundamentally about. Does it really measure what you want it to? Well, not really. It doesn't really measure learning in a holistic or comprehensive way. That would require qualitative assessment, and the kind of qualitative assessment that is ongoing and constant. This isn't scalable. This doesn't fit with the business model of universities, schools, training providers. It doesn't fit with professional bodies like the APM. So we use grades as a proxy for the qualitative measure, a qualitative objective we're trying to measure. Now, you could say that that's a perfectly acceptable trade-off, and in many cases you may be right, but it's the third question that will be really the key one here. Is it going to have a distorting or detrimental effect on behavior? And when it comes to grades, I would argue that this is indisputably true. So if you look at the way most people actually approach learning at level 4 and above, it's primarily an assessment-focused learning process. Learning for assessment leads to teaching for assessment, which leads to very selective approaches to the material, because that's effectively what's being measured. The principle that's just a human principle is that if a metric becomes a KPI, and there's some kind of consequence, either positive or negative, attached to it, then people will optimize for that metric. They're not optimizing for the qualitative objective because there is little to no positive or negative consequence for achieving that qualitative objective. Instead, the optimization will occur for the KPI instead. Now, if you have a well-chosen KPI which necessitates achieving the qualitative objective, then that is really no issue whatsoever. Then you're not going to have a detrimental effect on behavior. If, however, you do have a KPI which can be optimized for without necessarily achieving the qualitative objective, then what you're going to have is a situation where the KPIs is optimized for, the KPI is showing excellent performance, but the qualitative objective is not being achieved in some kind of meaningful or substantive way. I would say my professional assessment as working in the education sector is that this is true to a massive extent. You have huge amounts of learning for assessment, and you also have, sadly, a lot of teaching for assessment, because it's not just a case of students who are optimizing for KPIs. You also have staff optimizing for KPIs because they have professional consequences depending on their grades or the grades that their students achieve. So from both sides, you have an optimization for KPIs and grades based upon a type of assessment such as exams, which are increasingly common, again because of lockdown and so on, as well as online exams and lockdown browsers and all this other stuff that's coming back into vogue. They are also relatively easy to administer and relatively straightforward to mark. So there's an entire feedback loop has developed around this KPI. If we look at this within the context of a supply contract, we can easily see where poorly chosen or just slightly askew KPIs can also have a distorting or detrimental effect on behavior. If you have the requirement to achieve certain scale, and that's your particular KPI, and you don't have the balancing KPIs checking quality, perhaps for the understandable reason that if scale is a huge concern, you're not necessarily going to have the delays built in for the kind of QC that you would need, and then your end result is going to be more defects than would otherwise have occurred, because you're encouraging the supplier to optimize for scale, and you're not putting sufficient safeguards in place with regards to QC. So that would be a simple example, but you would get lots of these examples in even deeper and more meaningful ways. And the history of human behavior and human organization is littered with poorly chosen KPIs that have been optimized for, but it actually produces a net negative effect on the actual qualitative, holistic assessment of behavior. This isn't just because KPIs can be poorly chosen because of a misunderstanding of the relationship between KPIs and qualitative assessments, although I think that is to some degree missing as well. It can also happen because KPIs are easy to monitor. This is increasingly becoming a problem because we have increasing ability to automate data collection and data capture, and since we can easily automate this, it's becoming easier to run comprehensive reports to understand various quantitative metrics, so we can even very easily set up automated KPI alerts. We have data dashboards where you have various streams of automatically captured data being plugged into systems, integrated systems which produce data. I mean, data dashboards themselves are an example of managed by wire systems, and that encourages the perception that this kind of automated data capture and this instantly updated KPI dashboard allows you to understand exactly what's happening. That itself is a significantly worrying development, and there is interesting research out there which is suggests that KPIs are insufficiently tuned to the actual holistic measures of success, which they should be. So enough with my massive concerns over the proliferation of KPIs, and instead moving on to how these all in theory link together. So what you would have ideally would be an identification of your critical success factors, and these, as we said before, should not be measuring success or trying to describe what success looks like. Instead, they should be an exploration of what the requirements for a successful process are, identifying the competencies which are required, and identifying key factors which need to be in place in order to produce a successful outcome, or in order to produce a successful process. This would lead into ideally well-chosen KPIs which try to closely match the qualitative objective that we're going for through the smart use of quantitative metrics, and then it's these quantitative metrics, these KPIs, that should be rolled into your SLAs as a way of monitoring and appraising performance on a regular basis or an ongoing basis within the SLA.